Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do my book haul revisit for the month of August. If you're unfamiliar, this is where I look back at August book hauls from the past and see how many of the books I have read, how many I would still like to read, which books I might have unhauled, and sort of think about any books that are still in my library that I might want to unhaul. It's my way of making myself a more accountable reader and a more accountable book purchaser. It's really helped me in the past think about how I consume books, and it's helped me decide how I spend money on books since, money is a limited resource and all of that. Just some quick notes before we begin. I'm not going to spend pretty much any time talking about what these books are about. I will have links to the original book haul video down below. If you would like that information, feel free to check those out because that will have all of the information about the books that you would like. I have also removed titles that were purchased as part of my Pulitzer Prize project, and it's Sue Grafton titles, things like that, because those were purchased for library building purposes. In many cases, or some cases at least, I had already read all of the Sue Grafton books. I just wanted to have them in my library, and Pulitzer Prize project, I just wanted to have copies of all of the books. So they're sort of a permanent position in my library. It's a different purpose, and not really part of it like a book haul where this is a book that I want to read for other purposes. I'm going to start with the most recent one. We have 4 Augusts to look at, and we will work our way back in time, and let's dive in and begin. Last August is a very special or unique book haul to revisit because there were actually only 4 videos in that. I've removed one of them from this because it was a Pulitzer Prize book. It was Less by Andrew Sean Greer. I had already read it when I purchased it, and I reread it as part of my Pulitzer Prize project, so it's not here. I should also mention, before we really dive in, that I have made a decision going forward, because now we're at 4 years, and once we get to next year, I'll have 5 years of book hauls to revisit. I'm going to remove books that I have unhauled in the future, so I don't have to keep talking about them, because as it is, some of these books were unhauled when I did my revisit last year, and I'm still going to be talking about them, so I don't want to do that anymore. But anyway, August of last year, there were 4 books, now there are only 3, but I've read all of them. So I'm just going to tell you right off the bat, this is a 100% success story, and that I don't think has happened ever in any of my book hauls or book haul revisits. I think even at the time I hauled them, there was one that I hadn't read, and I knew it was going to be one of my next books. So just wild success story. The first one is The Queens of Sarmiento Park by Camila Sosa Villada. This was published in the US as Bad Girls, which is actually a more accurate translation of the title. This is a works in translation. So actually, if you are looking for a book for Women in Translation Month, this would be a great option. Camila Sosa Villada is a transgender author and certainly qualifies for Women in Translation Month because trans women are women. So I read this as part of the Queer Books in Translation read-along that I was doing with Jen the Librarian last year, and it was a great book, a very interesting book. It was a little love it or hate it with the people in the group, and I think there are a little bit of flaws, but it's a quick read as well, and a very interesting book. This is the UK cover. I intentionally got this one because I liked it so much better than the US one. But again, all of these books from August of last year, 2022, are success stories. So I read that one, and I also read The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. This was actually sent to me by my sister because my niece had a summer reading project. She could basically pick whatever book she wanted, but she needed to read something. So and she's not much of a reader. So my sister and I had this long conversation with her about trying to find a book that she would be interested in. And then the deal was that we would buddy read it. My sister would read it, I would read it, and my niece would read it. And we went with The Last Unicorn. I had seen the movie as a kid and been horrified by it. So I was a little interested / suspicious going to the book. It was really great. I liked it a lot. And it was a fun summer reading project that I did with my sister and my niece. So this was another one. I think Queens of Sarmiento Park and Last Beagle were the ones that I had already read by the time I did my book haul, I believe. And the one that I knew I was going to be getting to next was Nightcrawling by Leila. Mottley, another success story. Actually, you can see this is where it usually lives on my bookshelf. It's usually faced out. I had to remove it, so there's a big empty spot. I read it. I liked it. I'm really looking forward to seeing what Leila Mottley does next in her career. So there you go. 3 books, technically 4, read all of them, and none of them are going anywhere. I'm very happy keeping them on my shelf, so they will just continue to live there. No unhauls to report, and again, unless through some miracle at some point I am really running low on space and have to make some tough decisions, maybe I would think about getting rid of one of them, but that's a long way off. We expanded my library in January, and I still have a lot of space in here, so it's not going to happen anytime soon. Now we get to August of 2021. This is where things start to get a little more interesting because we run into books I haven't read. We run into books that I have unhauled. Let's dive in. The first one was Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez. This was actually a gift. It was sent to me by Erica from The Broken Spine. Thank you again, Erica. I have failed you, Erica, because 2 years on, I still haven't read this book. I had been wanting to read this book for a while, and I kind of thought that if I had it in my library, I would get to it, and clearly that has not been the case. So this is something that I still see on my shelf a fair amount and think about, I really want to read that. And somehow it just hasn't happened yet. And I really need to make that happen. So it hasn't happened yet, but it will. I believe, I'm choosing to be optimistic about this. It will happen someday, especially since this was a very kind gift from Erica. And I'm really looking forward to getting to it at some point. I think when I do read it, I'm pretty sure I'm going to like it. It's just a matter of, there's so many things to read. And finding the time, fitting it in, the right moment will eventually come. Like, circumstances will align, I believe, and it's going to happen. It just has not happened yet. Then we get to a book that I did read, but have unhauled. Damnation Spring by Ash Davidson. I did like this book. Didn't love it, but I liked it. And I think that liked, not loved, meant that when I was really having a crunch for space, it sort of made it an obvious choice for an unhaul, because I'm not going to reread it, and I didn't really love it, so it didn't need a space. I liked it, but, so when I really had that crunch, I had to make some tough calls, and this was one of them. But I did like it. It had a really drawn-out reading process, because I started reading it at the time one of my dogs got sick, and there is a dog in it, and I knew something bad was going to happen to the dog, so I really resisted making any progress in the book, but I did manage to finish it, and it's a success story from that perspective. It's just not here anymore. But it's a fine book. If you are interested in reading it, you could do a lot worse. But just know, if things that happen to animals are a trigger for you, buyer beware. The next one is something I did not read and unhauled. It's Once There Were Wolves by Charlotte McConaghy. This book sounded really interesting, and I got very cilantro comments. Some people liked it, some people really did not. And at that same time period when I was having a really bad crunch for space, again, before we expanded my library, I sort of sat down and thought, feedback has been very mixed on this book. Based on that, am I likely to get to it at any point? And I decided, because the feedback was so mixed and because so much time had passed, I felt like this is a book that I would be more likely to listen to on audio. And if I'm going to listen to it on audio, I really probably don't need to have this copy of the book, especially since I don't feel any urgency to prioritize it because I've had such mixed feedback on it. So I got rid of it, because if I'm going to eventually do it on audio, why hold on to it? So I could still end up reading this. I just really don't have any urgency to get to it. Like, I'm pretty sure it's still saved in my queue on Scribd, but it's at this point way down on the list. And that kind of makes it unlikely that I'll get to it, but maybe someday. So it is something that I let go of, and, I'm okay with it. But there you go. Then we have Afterparties, stories by Anthony Veasna. So I have not read this book, but I would still like to. And I have at many points considered it and really thought about picking it up. There have been situations where I have pulled a couple of books from my shelf thinking, sometimes you like to pull options for your next book, and then you sort of read the description of it, maybe read the first page and sort of decide which book is striking your mood the best. This has been in the mix several times in that situation, and for one reason or another, it just hasn't made the cut. But eventually, it will happen. I've heard some pretty good things about it, and I would still really like to get to it. So it's not going anywhere. The final one for August of 2021 was Heartstopper Volume 1 by Alice Oseman. I have read this. I've actually read all of the published Heartstopper books except for the little mini one that Alice Oseman did. But I've read all of them. I have been watching the show. I've watched the first season. The second season just debuted, and Joel and I are working our way through it slowly. So we've only watched 2 episodes of it so far. But we will continue with that. And I would be interested in continuing to read the series. It's pretty cute, so there's no denying that. So another success story there, but still a mixed bag for August of 2021. There were 5 books that I brought into my library. I have only read 2, and I unhauled 2. So there are 3 books left in my library, and, I'm still interested in reading them. That's the good news. The ones that I still have in my library, the ones that I haven't gotten to, Rainbow Milk and Afterparties. So, and I might get to Once There Were Wolves on audio at some point. It's just not part of my library anymore. That takes us to August of 2020, which is a larger book haul than those. Now, I've mentioned the huge crunch for space that I was having last year. So I'll put the video of my library tour after we expanded the library down below, because I think I explained what the library looked like before, but it was much smaller. Not like this didn't exist behind me. So I really had a crunch for space. So the first 2 books in this were unhauls. And part of why they're unhauls is that let me just tell you what they are. Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga and This Mournable Body by Tsitsi Dangarembga. The reason they ended up on my radar is that This Mournable Body was nominated for, or longlisted for, the Booker Prize. I can't remember if it made the shortlist at this point, because a lot has happened since then. And I was interested in it, but it was the 3rd book in a trilogy. So I felt like I should go back and read Nervous Conditions first. And I weirdly purchased This Mournable Body and purchased Nervous Conditions, but didn't purchase the second book. It's probably for the best because I unhauled both of them. But the reason I unhauled them is that I started hearing some wildly mixed reactions to the books. And then as time went on, the urgency to get to them really started to go down. And then when I really needed space in my library, sort of similar to what happened with Once There Were Wolves, I looked around, and there is an audio of Nervous Conditions on Scribd. It's still in my saved list, and I just started thinking, at this point, the urgency has died down. Nobody's really talking about these books anymore. So if I'm going to get to this, it's probably going to be on audio anyway. And I've heard really mixed things about it. So it's probably going to be a long time from now if I do get to them. So what am I doing holding on to them when I really need space for other books that I have much more urgency to get to or would really like to keep in my library? So that's what happened here. I could still potentially read them, but I would have to start at the beginning. And that was sort of the thing with This Mournable Body. It's like I have like 2 steps that I need to take before I could even read this book, and I haven't taken those. I haven't taken the first step, so let alone the second one. So that's why I made a tough call last summer. And these tough calls, by the way, are part of the thing that led my husband, Joel, who is wonderful, to say, listen, why don't we just look at trying to figure out a way to expand your library and work it that way? He's good. And that led to all this. So those are books that I have not read and did let go of. And then let's get to a happier story, a success story. The Yield by Tara June Winch. I did read this book, and I really loved it. In fact, this was one of the books that I included in my video about the 25 best books of the last 25 years. I'll link that video in the description box down below. It was really fun to put together. A lot of work, but fun to put together. And I am very happy that this book was included in there because I think it's a great book. And if you have not read it, I would really recommend it to you. Great book, great author, and I love the cover as well. Doesn't mean anything, but I do love, I especially love that the cover ends up having resonance with the book itself. like your appreciation of the cover deepens when you read the book and find out that there is actual meaning behind this design. It's not just a cool graphic, it really means something. So, fantastic book. If you want more about it, you can either check out the original book haul video again, or I will have the 25 best books of the last 25 years, and this is featured in that one. So check it out. Next is Filthy Beasts by Kirkland Hamill. I entirely picked this up because I was in an independent bookstore, and as I was browsing, someone who worked there asked me if I had read this book, and they started talking about it, and they said, based on other things that you've purchased, I feel like you would like this. And as they were describing it, it really sounded like something that I would be interested in. It's nonfiction. And I always appreciate when a bookseller really like pays attention, and I love the recommendations anyway, but when they really curate something like that, there's care and there's time in saying like, hey, actually, you are the type of reader who would probably like something like this. So to me, that's worth a lot. So I purchased the book for that reason. I did not have any urgency to get to it. It was more just like, hey, that's really cool that you thought of me for this. So thank you. And I would still like to get to it at some point. Obviously, it survived a lot of the tough choices that I made last summer, so it's still very much in the mix. I will say, one thing I've learned doing book haul revisits is that I am much more likely to read a nonfiction book on audio. So without that bookseller connection, I probably would have looked for this on audio, and that is probably how I will ultimately read this book, but it's not going anywhere. Not for a while. I have a lot of space in my nonfiction section, and I would be very interested to get to it at some point. So it's not going anywhere, and we'll see when I eventually get to it. That takes us to Luster by Raven Leilani, which is a book that I did read, and again, I feel like a broken record talking about how I was really crunched for space last summer. This is a book that I sort of is on the cusp of being something that I loved, but is really just something that I liked, because I think there are flaws in the plotting of the book. And ultimately, those made it impossible for me to love it. But I think it's a really good and well done depiction of a person who is suffering from really bad depression, making very bad choices about their life. And that means that your mileage may vary when you read the book, because if you can't handle a character who makes sort of maddening decisions, it's not going to be a good book for you. I found it compelling from that perspective. It's just that some of the plotting didn't quite land for me. And it's that aspect that made me say, I really need space. Maybe this is a book that I can set free and free up a little space for myself. So that's entirely what happened. But I did read it. I did read it. So there's at least that. Now, we have The Death of Vivek Oji by Akwaeke Emezi. I have not read this yet, but I would still really like to. And this is another book, kind of like Afterparties, that has frequently been in the mix for me to read. And it just hasn't happened yet, but I do firmly believe that it will happen at some point. It's just a matter of the stars aligning in the correct way for my mood and my availability to, pick something off of the shelf for this to be the next book. It will happen. It will happen. I consistently hear good things about Akwaeke Emezi in general, but about this book. And I'm really looking forward to reading it as such. So someday I will read an Akwaeke Emezi book, and when I do, it will most likely be The Death of Vivek Oji. We end with two success stories, like wild success stories. First is Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart. Now, the reason these are both success stories at the end of the August 2020 book haul is that I read both of them and I loved both of them. They were in my top 3 favorite books of the year. The Yield was actually, I think, in my top 4, maybe 5 books of the year when I purchased it. So I loved Shuggie Bain. This was the book that won the Booker, and it's just a fantastic book. I was a lot more mixed on Young Mungo, which was Douglas Stewart's follow-up, but we're not here to talk about that book right now. I loved Shuggie Bain. I would absolutely recommend it to you. It is bleak in a lot of ways, and a lot of people can't. I understand why a lot of people can't handle that, but it resonated very deeply and profoundly with me. And for that reason, it will always have a place on my shelf. I loved it, and I would recommend it to you if you can stomach a lot of the difficult things about that book. The final one, Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, another book I absolutely loved. The language in this book is beautiful, stunning. It is about grief. So again, if that's something that you are not really free to engage with right now, because grief can be difficult if you are dealing with and processing grief yourself, or just in general, but it's a really beautiful story. I loved it. Again, it was one of my top reads of the year 2020. I believe it was 2020 when I read both of these books, and not that I caught up to them later, but fantastic book. I have the American version. I know a lot of people preferred the British cover of this, but you know, what am I going to do? I live in America, so this was the one that was available, and I actually really like this cover of it because it seems to me it has a little more thematic resonance. The feather over the eyes. I don't know. Like, I'm not in love with that cover, but it's fine, I think. So, August of 2020, I brought 8 books into my library. I read 4. So that's a 50% success rate. That's pretty good. I tend to do okay with my August book hauls, it turns out. And that's pretty good. I have unhauled 3. 2 of them were unread, and one of them I had read and liked, but I just really needed space, and I figured I'm not going to revisit it at any point. Unfortunately, I have ended up talking about Lester a fair amount, and I don't have a copy of it to hold up anymore, but that's fine. I don't really need to hold up a copy of a book, and I'm certainly not going to keep a book just so I have an edition of it that I can hold up. Let's get to the final book haul in this revisit, August of 2019. This is the largest one because 2019 was my first year on BookTube, and generally speaking, enthusiasm for BookTube and the conversations that were coming from it made me purchase a lot more books. And since then, I've calmed down a little bit. This year has been a bit of an increase because since I have the extra space in the library, I've been purchasing more books, and I'm starting to calm that down as well. But let's dive in. So this is a lot larger than the others. There are 11 books that we're going to talk about in this one. The first is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. When the long list for the Booker Prize was announced that year, this was the book that really immediately jumped out to me and just was like, I need to read that book. So I immediately ordered it. It was not available in the US, so I ordered it from the UK. And then it made the shortlist. I was like, oh, I really want to read that. And then it tied for the win. And I think I ended up reading it the following year, but I did read it and I really liked it. I personally, and I don't think I'm alone on this, I think it is the book that should have won the Booker on its own. But that's okay. At least it won. And I think the opposite of what everyone was afraid of ended up happening. So when it co-won the Booker, I think a lot of people were concerned that the other book that won, Margaret Atwood's The Testaments, because Margaret Atwood was so established as an author and so popular, I think people were concerned that that is the book that everyone would focus on and that this one would really fade away and people would sort of forget about it. I think the opposite has ended up happening. And part of that is because Margaret Atwood was so gracious about the circumstances and really yielded the spotlight to Bernardine Evaristo. And Bernardine Evaristo over the next year almost became, especially with the pandemic, she ended up really becoming the face of the Booker. And again, I think part of it is because Margaret Atwood generously ceded the spotlight to her. But this is the book that people think of most, actually. And that's, I think, correct. But it's a great book, and I would certainly recommend it to you if you have not read it. Now we get to, I'm going to lump these books together because I purchased them all for the same thing. These are definitely library builders. If you haven't watched any of my book haul revisits or my book hauls, I talk about library builders a fair amount. These are books that you don't have any immediate plans to read, but you would like to have in your library because they're kind of cool. They fit the vibe of what you'd like to read or your personality, and you would like to have them available so you can read them someday. That's why I purchased all 3 of these. These are purchased by Arsenal Pulp Press. They were part of a series called Little Sisters Classics. I don't know if they do that anymore, but it was a really cool initiative. So Arsenal Pulp Press did Little Sisters Classics because they looked for queer books that were in danger of being forgotten and that they sort of wanted to remind people of and help establish them as queer classics. Really cool initiative. I really applaud it. So I picked a couple of them that were interesting, and I have some in other months, so they're not in this book haul, but I do have other ones from this series. Really quickly, they are Song of the Loon by Richard Amory. So the cool thing as well is that they put, I think, the first edition jacket on there, and this first edition jacket is wild. Someday I will get around to this. They also have a lot of supplemental material in the back of the book that is really cool to help put the book in context and just give you additional information about it. So the first one is Richard Amory's Song of the Loon. Then we have Blackbird by Larry Duplichan. This is a book that I've come the closest to reading this one because this has been in the mix for my Pride Month pile of possibilities a couple of times. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I will someday. And Patience and Sarah by Isabel Miller. So I haven't read any of them, but I love the project that led to their existence, and I would like to get to them someday. Definitely library builders. Like, I don't have immediate plans to get to any of them, but I will hopefully get to them at some point. Becoming a Man by Paul Monette is next, and this feels like an abject failure to me because every year I tell myself I want to read a Paul Monette book, and somehow every year I end up not reading a Paul Monette book. Joel has read one, not this one, but and he liked it. So someday it's going to happen, and this is the one that's most likely, partially because it's the one that I have in my library. I do think I would probably end up listening on audio, but that's fine. Paul Monette is an author. I'm very fine having a copy of his books in my library. This is the only one that I actually own right now, and I will get to it at some point. I will. Paul Monette is one of those authors. Paul Monette and Edmund White are queer authors I have not read yet and really need to. So someday it will happen. Someday it will happen. Next is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Now, this is actually not the edition of the book that I hauled in August of 2019. The one that I hauled back then turned out, so I buddy read this book, and I thought we were done, and the person I was buddy reading with was like, no, we're only halfway through, there's more. So it turned out the edition that I hauled in August of 2019 only had half of the book. There's a tricky thing about Little Women. It was actually, there was the first half of the book was the initial volume of it. And then it was so popular that Louisa May Alcott published a sort of sequel. And nowadays, most editions of the book lump them both together. And the movies treat it like one story. So you don't even think about it because nowadays, most editions of the book just have them both together. And that's what we think of as Little Women. So the edition that I had hauled, I quickly got rid of and got a new edition of. So this is the one that I still have. It's cute. It's tiny. What's funny is, as I was reading it, I always take the dust jacket off. So when I was carrying it around, people would tell me, that's a really pretty edition of the Bible. And it is not the Bible. It's Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. It is the Bible to some people, I would be willing to bet. So I did read this book, and I'm glad that I did because it was a good reading experience. Then we have Away in the World by V.S. Naipaul. This sort of miraculously survived the cull last summer, and I think I did pull it off of my shelves for space because I got this for $1 at my local used bookstore, and because I got it for $1, it was in their clearance section, but that means there's no exchange, like you can't bring it back to them. So I did pull it off of my shelf intending to unhaul it because I was thinking, when am I going to get around to this book? I have Half a Life. I haven't read that one. That's the one that I'm probably going to read first. I only bought this one because it's $1. So I did pull it from my shelf. And then because I couldn't exchange it at my local used bookstore, it was sitting on a pile waiting to be donated. And then the library expanded and it was still here. And I decided, you know what? It was only $1. This is a Nobel Prize winning author. If I read Half a Life, and as long as I have the space, I might as well just put it back in my library. So this survived the cull that claimed many books in this book haul revisit. I have no immediate plans to get to it. Again, I really only purchased it because it was $1 and a very notable author. So who knows if I will ever get around to reading it. But as long as I am not in a crunch for space, it'll be fine hanging around here. Now we have Breath Eyes Memory. We're almost done, by the way, by Edwidge Danticat. This is something I found at my local used bookstore, also for $1. And this one I would definitely get around to reading. I can't believe I still have not read Edwidge Danticat. I need to fix that, and I need to not drop books. So I haven't read it yet, but I still have plans to do so. Then we have The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. This is another one that I found at my local used bookstore for $1. It's a Dover Thrift Edition, which I think even sells for, oh no, it sells for $5. Wow. Inflation hit the Dover Thrift Editions. It was bound to happen at some point. I read The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton years ago. I can't remember. I think it might have been in my first year on BookTube. But anyway, I'd love to read more, and The House of Mirth seems like a likely place to go. So I still plan to get to it. Then we have Ohio by Stephen Markley. I found this at my local used bookstore. It's actually an advanced reader's edition of the book that was there, and I purchased it. I have not gotten around to reading. I keep hearing great things about this book, and I should get around to it at some point, but I have not at this point. The final book in this book I'll revisit is Dominicana by Angie Cruz, and I recently decided to unhaul this book because the urgency to read it has really died down since it was published, and it seems like it's a bit of a cilantro book. I hear very mixed things about it, and even people who like it don't seem to love it. They seem to be like, that's a good book, you should read it. So I made a tough call and decided, because the reaction has been so mixed, because the urgency has really died down, it's sort of like Once There Were Wolves. The audio is out there. So if I'm going to read it, I'll probably do it that way. And for that reason, I don't really need the physical book anymore. So I brought 11 books into my library in August of 2019. I've only read 2. Girl, Woman, Other, and Little Women. And I've unhauled 1, and that is Dominicana. And like I said, I did actually technically unhaul The Way in the World. It worked its way back in. And 3 of these books are library builders that I had no urgency to get to. I really just wanted them because they're cool books, those Little Sisters classics. So overall, in the last 4 Augusts, I have brought 27 books into my library. I've read 11. That's not great, but it's what is half? It's not half. I can't do math, but it's almost half, I think. So that's not a bad track record. I've unhauled 6, which is also not bad. And there isn't really anything that I'm thinking would immediately be unhauled. So that's not bad either. And, the tricky thing about thinking about unhauls is that there's really not much urgency for unhauls right now, since I still have a fair amount of space. But it's still worth having these conversations anyway. So that is my book haul revisit for the month of August 2023. If you have feedback on any of these books or thoughts about ones that I should prioritize or recommendations based on my interest in any of these books, I'd love to hear it in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.